So good morning, and thanks so much for joining us for this 50 Acres webinar. Today we're looking at the federal government, the newly re-elected federal government, and from a perspective of those of you who are based or have operations in the ACT in Canberra. And so the beginning of the webinar, we will be focusing on the election result, what we can read into it, what we can think, what we can read into it in terms of future action and some engagement ideas in terms of how to approach engaging with the new government. And then we'll be focusing on the ACT for those of you who've got operations or are based in the ACT or headquartered in the ACT. There are many organisations, national organisations who are located in the ACT but are national organisations, so I'm not sure who's joined today, but welcome to all. For those of you who want to make any comments or questions, I always like to weave those in as I go. Really happy to take your questions and comments as we progress, and I'll respond to them as they come up. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I'm coming to you from today, the land of the Ngunnawal people, which is also the ACT, the land of the Ngunnawal people, and the Ngambri people as well. And pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I suppose everyone else is probably in the ACT. So, but there may be some others who are in other places in Australia. I know we've got someone on the line from Perth, our managing director, Tammy Wayne Elliott, and I'm not quite sure where Susan and Madison are, but acknowledging wherever they're coming from as well. Okay. So what we're going to cover today, we want to look at how did Labor win? What's different for this election? What's the sort of, there's a lot of firsts for the election, which is quite remarkable. What's happened in the Senate? What's next in terms of what can we expect from this government? And then looking ahead, how can we engage with them politically and in terms of a policy settings? And then some really practical tips about how to engage with the government at a federal level. And then a focus on ACT organisations or those based or have operations in the ACT, thinking about approaching engagement. Is there anything a bit different that you can think about being ACT-based, Canberra-based organisations? So how did Labor win? Well, Labor's win was bigger than most people expected, fair to say. I think, some people said that they thought it was going to happen all along, but I'm not quite sure that anyone quite thought Labor was going to get to 94. There was certainly a number of seats that weren't on the party's radar. So seats like Banks and Hughes and some others who, if you look at the candidates who are now MPs, I think one of them was 24, the one in Hughes and the fellow in Banks, I'm not quite sure, he was a former diplomat, I think. Contrasting to, say, Ali France's campaign, where they obviously had a lot of professionals coming in to help run socials and the look and feel of the campaign. In Hughes and Banks, they had, a small group of mainly elderly party members who were sort of handing out things at stations, railway stations, and they only had about 10 Instagram posts. So it was pretty cute, but it was, I think, an interesting reflection on why, I think we need to look at why those sorts of seats moved when they weren't on the radar of the party. I'm not sure that those candidates or those now MPs probably would have predicted necessarily that they were going to win. They probably weren't doing any polling in those seats, so they may not have had visibility on how they were going. They may have had a gut instinct. But I think it's a bigger picture. I think we need to zoom out and look at why those sorts of seats fell during the election. We'll get to what the actual figures tell us, and it's a little bit more complicated than what we might think at first glance. But those sorts of seats that pushed the numbers up to 94, I think moved because they were just not buying what the coalition was selling. They're in the mortgage belt. They were probably they probably benefited from things like work from home. They probably weren't happy about the prospect of, you know, perhaps people being made redundant in the public service if they were public servants, or perhaps the impact that might have had broadly on the employment market. Uh, so I'm not sure that it was a philosophical or ideological move in those seats. I think it was really probably hip pocket issues, which brings us down to why. I think the campaign was very focused. It's fair to say that the Prime Minister was very focused in the election. His performance in 2022 was solid, but there was a couple of wobbly points. Obviously, there was the one time in the election that's just gone where he fell or didn't fall off a stage. That was really the only sort of slight wobble. And apart from that, really, it was, no, I wouldn't say flawless, but there wasn't any major gotcha moments. And if you sort of see, if you're the sort of person that studies the form guide like I do, one of the things that the Prime Minister didn't have control of, I think, in 2022 and has gained control of since he's been in office was the press pack. I think he's now very disciplined in terms of, and some journalists have, you know, called him like a teacher at the front of the room, very much in control of the class. And, you know, he'll go, you, then you, then you. And everyone sticks to the plan and really very much sort of falls in line. Not to say they don't ask robust questions, but they don't shout. So I think it's about him coming into his own. His performance was strong, and as a consequence, that was a stark contrast to what we saw from the opposition leader, where we saw a number of apologies, some things that went wrong. They said they got it wrong. They had to backtrack on it. They had to pivot. And then they pivoted again a couple of times on, say, work from home, for example, and on the public service redundancies. Initially, it was 40-something thousand were going to be made redundant or lose their jobs. Then it was going to be natural attrition. Then it came back to, yes, we will be making these people redundant, but it'll only be in Canberra. And then it was, you know, a stark contrast that, you know, that would have been 75% of the public service in Canberra and about 15% of the population. So those sorts of fairly stark, black and white, binary positions that didn't really have any room to move, I think was a stark contrast to the pretty focused approach from the Prime Minister. Labor put forward a really steady, practical plan that directly spoke to the concerns that people had. You know, one of the things that I've been saying is that Peter Dutton was very adept at being the opposition leader and putting forward an agenda or an argument or a series of arguments or a series of positions in opposition. He was a good opposition leader. He, you know, he labelled it cost of living crisis. The government called it cost of living concerns or cost of living pressures. Very different, sort of slightly different nuances there in language. But what we then saw was when Mr. Dutton then transitioned into being, you know, a leader fronting the election, he didn't transition as well as perhaps he could have. And that, you know, very black and white, reasonably robust, dare I say, reasonably aggressive at times, positioning didn't do him well, as well as the imagery for those of you who can recall, and I know some of you may have PTSD thinking about the election, but there was lots of pictures of the opposition leader in petrol stations filling up, you know, cars or trucks or vehicles with petrol. I think it was 15 or something, some amazing amount of times. I used to be in advance of Kim Beazley. I was the one who was responsible for setting up those sorts of things, that sort of imagery, and dare I say it, the repetition of that sort of image, it was really one-dimensional. It really didn't tell a story. I'm not quite sure why they kept doing it, but they did. So I think, the other thing that, from the opposition leader's point of view was he then in the last week or so, and I think they were concerned about the losing the vote, some of the vote to some of the right-wing parties on the far right. He then engendered some of the language around, welcome to countries and, immigration and, diversity and inclusion and those sorts of things. That didn't, I don't think, play out well for him, certainly with those communities. But also I'm thinking people were going, this isn't the main game. I'm not quite sure why we're talking about this. And I think it probably reinforced his very binary sort of view on life, which didn't help him. Labor put forward, steady, practical, pretty simple plan that spoke to those concerns. So they were giving things to people. The coalition were really taking things away or being negative about things. We're going to reduce welcome to country. We're going to get rid of diversity and inclusion appointments. We're going to, whatever it is, it was sort of taking rather than giving. And I think people were happy to back something. It was a simpler, more positive agenda, essentially. So what's different about this election? For the first time in history, Labor's left faction now holds more seats in the Labor caucus than the right. For those of you who aren't familiar with the factions, I'm sure many of you are, there's two main factions in the party. In the past, there used to be some others, but they have sort of gone now. There was a centre-left, but mainly coming out of Western Australia and South Australia. That doesn't exist anymore, really. But the left faction now has more seats in the caucus than the right for the first time in history, in Labor's history, certainly being in the parliament, which is a long time, over 100 years or so. Remember, the Labor Party was a party before the coalition was formed. The Liberal, it was if you know a bit of your history, the Labor Party has been a grouping for longer than any other in the parliament. Historically, it's the largest Labor grouping of members of parliament, of MPs in the House of Representatives. There is 94 of them. Won't get any bigger. There's no more recounts now. Although there might be a by-election in the seat of Bradfield. More on that in a minute. But at the same time, we're looking at the smallest coalition in years and the worst result in over 70 years. And obviously the perception is that they're not unified, that they've got some major differences of opinion, both philosophically and tactically. It's much more complicated than just looking at the numbers. If you look at the numbers on the House and Anthony Green or, any of the people, Tom Connell from Sky, or whoever it is standing in front of their model of the AI model or the simulated model of the seats in the House, you would be excused by thinking it was a landslide. You need to know that, with 2-point move, a 2-point move in the primaries, from Labor, from where it was, the House would look very different. It'd be a lot closer to, wouldn't be a minority government, but it would be a much smaller majority. So I don't think we can say it's a landslide. It was interesting in many seats. It wasn't. Swings are never uniform, as we know. Certainly that's the case here. We had swings against members of parliament in Victoria, probably a protest vote against the premier in her area, in her seat, or in that same geographical place. We had, people winning seats in Queensland where they didn't expect to. There was strange and odd results, but I wouldn't describe it as a landslide. Rather, the coalition was rejected, rather than people sort of, flocking to Labor in a sort of, extraordinary way. it wasn't quite that. That said, Labor has a very strong majority, and with that, they need to think about how they're going to use that effectively and without hubris. We'll get to that in a moment. So what's the Senate going to look like? So the government can still secure support from the coalition to pass, or will need to, through the Senate or the Greens. So they've got two effective pathways with the coalition, who are now back together, or negotiating with the Greens. Just this morning, for example, just in the last 24 hours, there was some talk about how they were going to get the super tax through Parliament. Yesterday, there was discussion that they were going to seek and receive the support of the coalition. Yesterday, a number of the Nats came out publicly, Matt Canavan, and I think probably behind him some others, saying that they weren't going to support it. So they wouldn't have got that through the Senate. And I would dare say that in the coalition party room, they probably wouldn't have got it through because, it wasn't worth pushing it probably in the room. So they're now going to negotiate with the Greens to get that legislation through, is the news that's come out this morning. What is really interesting is One Nation now has 4 senators, the same number as the Nationals in the Senate. I think that's interesting in the sense of how will they or might they change the political discourse in the nation's parliament. There's going to be 4 people, and they will continue to speak and they will get coverage. There are, and there continue to be people who are will give One Nation the voice space, and that will continue to happen. Be interesting to see what happens and what that does. So watch that. I think it'll be interesting. What's next? The coalition has officially reunited after Susan Lee and Nationals leader David Littleproud reached a formal agreement. One of the things that I do think is that David Littleproud's leadership is probably in a slight position of peril. He advanced that in the negotiations with Susan Lee, he posited that he wanted to have the ability for the National Party to be able to break cabinet solidarity on the floor of the chambers in the House or the Senate, as in they didn't have to vote together. Susan Lee rejected that, and then it came to light that it was in fact David Littleproud's own idea. That wasn't something that had been discussed or endorsed by the National Party room. So it'll be really interesting to see whether that and perhaps some other freelancing that he did in those negotiations might come back to haunt him and perhaps undermine his political position. There's a number of key people, a couple of former leaders who are outside of the shadow cabinet, Michael McCormack and Barnaby Joyce, who are now becoming best buddies. Politics is always interesting. Every day there is something else to think about and look at. So the key agenda thing, I think the key challenge now for the government is to deliver on the agenda that they took to the election. Obviously, one of the areas that they're trying to do that in, and I think one of the things that I'd like to reinforce to any organisations that are here today who are thinking in terms of things they might want to canvass with politicians, and bear in mind that in Canberra we have Andrew Leigh. And for those of you, and I dare say some of you on the line have met him, he's a friend of mine. We used to work together in a Senator Shadow Minister's office many years ago when he first came into a political role, and we're friends. I'm in awe of his ability to run marathons in the middle of an election, dare I say it, and he's really an elite athlete as well as being an elite thinker. But this is something that is really his thing. So if you are engaging with him as a not-for-profit or as an organisation or a company or anything, and productivity is something that you can think about in terms of how you might be able to think and put forward productivity gains or improvements in your own space. That is something to absolutely give consideration to. GDP reduced yesterday, went down yesterday. This is something that they're going to be thinking about in the context of the data that's coming out. Improvements to productivity allows governments to bank more money, and if they can do that, the bottom line of the budget improves. What that does is, like us all, if we have more money coming in, we can spend more. So it's as simple as that. Thinking about that, and if you're able to think about that and talk about that with government, that's something that I would urge you to have a think about. So what's their outlook in terms of where we're going now? So after this result, I'd like to say nothing can be assured or guaranteed. Tammy is on the line. She's my managing director. We've worked together for 3 years. She deals with my insecurities, and every day, probably multiple times a day. And one of the things that I continue to say to her and to others, anyone who'd listen, is, oh, just, who knows what's going to happen? And I'm a former Labor advisor. It's pretty clear. It's on my LinkedIn profile on the website. Everyone knows that. So clearly people probably knew where my philosophical thinking is on who I would have liked to win. But I think one of the things that we can say after this election is that really nothing is guaranteed. I mean, on the face of it, even the pollsters, we worked a lot with YouGov, and I'm sure many of you know YouGov. They were the biggest pollsters they did the biggest amount of data collection during the election. They did 340,000, sort of captured 340,000 pieces of data with their panel. Even they said that they thought the coalition was in a winning position in February this year. So it's an extraordinary turnaround. And they sort of said that it was the biggest move in polling, biggest move in the support base across the shortest period of time they'd ever seen in polling history, and that's something really. So what I want to say is, even though right now with 94 people in the House, big class of kids to be keeping in control, and we'll come back to that in a second. One of the things that I think is something that is always the case is nothing is guaranteed in politics. And right now, today, 5th of June, it's all looking reasonably rosy, but things happen in politics and we just never know what might happen. So I think we have to think long term. We have to think that there's a possibility that there's going to be a third term, i.e. the government will be in government for 6 more years from this point. It's unlikely that the coalition will probably have enough numbers, pretty unlikely looking at it, to get into a majority at the next election. They couldn't do it this election, and they had a lot less to go. But certainly to be able to achieve that at the next election is a pretty big ask. So, I think we can probably reasonably say that we've got a long-term Labor government. It is obviously the objective of the Prime Minister, and he's said this before. One of the things that I would urge you to look at, the two things. There was a podcast that he appeared on with Channel 9, or the Nine Media, last week with Paul Sakal, or last week, or I think it was last week, maybe a week, 2 weeks ago, and talking about his views about trying to make Labor the natural, or a more of a natural party of government, and that by being in government for the long term, it allows people to be able to make real change. Now the question is, what sort of change, how fast, and what it achieves. We'll think about that in 1 second. But that's his objective. I'd urge you to go and listen to that. And the other thing that I'd also suggest that you listen to, if you've got a moment and you want to indulge, is that Paul Erickson spoke at the press club a week or two ago and outlined what he saw as the rationale and the reasoning behind how they won. It's really worthwhile listening to that as well. You can get that on YouTube. It's on YouTube. Just search up National Press Club. So based on how the seats have fallen, including a few unexpected results, yep, we can see that it's probably unlikely coalition will be in government anytime soon. But I do think it will depend on a lot of things: the domestic performance of the government, perception and the behaviour of the Labor government. There's a lot of people there. There's going to be a lot of backbenchers. There are 64 backbenchers, 30 ministers. It's a lot of backbenchers to be able to engage with and to keep occupied and to keep out of trouble. I can tell you that. If the Prime Minister continues to perform like he did in the election, I think it's reasonable to think that they may go on to governor for a while. Lots of people thinking about a lot of things, making a lot of theories. So where do we go from here? Sorry, we try and move the slide is what we do. So what are the options? Everyone's saying, are they going to be cautious? Are they going to be bold? A lot of people are saying that they need to be bold, that they need to do everything. And I suppose what I would say is if you look at, if you just searched up budget submissions from this year or the year before, if you looked at if you looked at every single thing that people had in a budget submission, and if the government went, yep, we're just going to do it all, we're just going to do it all, we're going to do everything that everyone asks of us, what do you think would happen? The economy would plummet probably because it would seem like there was no rationale to making those decisions. There'd be probably excessive spending. There'd be disagreements on priorities. All I'm saying. So what I'm saying to you now is that governments can't do everything. They simply cannot. They don't want to philosophically, and they can't afford to politically and economically. So how do we as organisations looking in from the outside get them to perhaps be a bit more bolder than they were? I'm going to be speaking at a conference next week in Canberra called Australian Progress, which is the leadership dialogue of not-for-profit leaders. And, that's one of the topics for a few of the sessions. What is reasonable? What can we push them on? Where do we want to be in 5 to 10 years' time? Big questions. I'm not sure that we're going to solve it in the next half an hour. But I think Paul Erickson, and that's one of the things I would urge you, just to read all these tea leaves. I think it's really important that we are arming ourselves with this information. I think it's helpful. Paul Erickson, at his speech at the press club, did say that, and he's from the left, he was handpicked by the Prime Minister for the role. He urged the party to deliver on what it took to the election, which means that they voted for what they said on the label in the supermarket. They picked it up. They went for that tube of toothpaste rather than the other one, or that bottle of, that jar of peanut butter rather than the other one, because they wanted that label rather than the other. And so he was urging them to, do what they've said. Now, that's not to say that they can't do a bit more than what they've said. And that's the question I think we need to ask ourselves. They're going to want to do what they said they do, but how much more can they do without it being controversial, expensive, placing the economy into some sort of precarious position, creating other sorts of issues and other sorts of problems for them. So that's the question I think we need to think about when we take our ideas to government. There's some early signs. I think that the ministers are looking to be bolder, that there are a number of ministers looking to be bolder. I'm aware of a couple of senior staffing appointments which have not become public yet, in some areas which indicate that I think that there may be some slight interest in some of the portfolios being a little bit more ambitious in the long term. And there's been some interesting and slightly different nuances of policy statements. So what I would urge people to do is, if you're dealing with a particular minister or a particular portfolio area or multiple portfolio areas and multiple ministers, go and look at the speeches that they've made since the election, break down the words of everything they've said. Excuse me. Look for the differences in the words that they have said, perhaps than what they were saying before the election. Obviously, they were being a bit cautious before the election, but I think it's really important to go and read everything that they said. Andrew Leigh made a major speech this week. Emma McBride has made a number of speeches on mental health in the last couple of weeks. All of these point to some changes. Now, words are one thing, actions are another, and that's the thing that we need to be aware of and need to be talking to them about. So how do we engage? We'll get to that in some practical tips in a second, but I think based on the result, it's fair to say, excuse me, just going to have a gulp of my coffee. It would be fair to say that it would serve your organisation well if you focus on developing some long-term trusted relationships with advisors, with ministers and backbenchers. We always say that. Yeah, we say that, long-term relationships. It's not speed dating, is it, right? So what does that mean? I think we need to assume that they're thinking longer term. They don't want to think about what they're going to do in July. Yes, they've got to think about what they're going to do tomorrow and this afternoon and all that stuff. But what's their sort of longer term objectives? And talk to them about that. See where you align on that. I think they will want trusted partners. So what I would like to say is, you can absolutely have some disagreements, and being combative is an option. I would say being confidently putting a position that may differ from some of the government's position is an option. But I think what's more important in the first instance is to find areas of alignment. They have a really big majority. They don't need the coalition in the House. They don't need the crossbench in the House, obviously. And so it's up to you to find some areas of agreement, I think, in the first instance, before you perhaps do anything more than that. Challenge, but you need to do that with evidence that backs up your position. The other thing that I want to point to is the media landscape and how that really, I suppose, evolved. It has been evolving, obviously, for some time, years and years and decades. But I think where a lot of the election was fought was in new media or non-traditional media, podcast influencers. So think about how you might be able to deploy and engage and leverage from those sorts of opportunities. Backbench social media feeds, are you able to help all these 64 Labor backbenchers, for example, and perhaps some others, but I think Labor's the main game really, in putting forward content that may support you. We will be doing a webinar about that in the coming weeks. So let's think about some practical points about how to engage federally, and if anyone's got any questions, please don't hesitate to pop them into the Q&A box. So obviously, and understand the new landscape first up. There's a lot of staffing changes that are underway. Some ministers are reassessing staff roles. And basically, at the end of an election, every staff role needs to be you need to renegotiate. The jobs don't continue. You're out of a job, then you renegotiate your job, and then you are back in a job. So that's underway at the moment. There's still some officers who have not completed that. There are some officers who are part the way through that. The staffing allocations, I'm not sure whether they've been finalised with the opposition and the crossbench as of, I think, Friday last week. That hadn't been done. I haven't heard any stories since then, so I'm not sure about where that's up to. Revisit your engagement history. where did your last conversation with ministers or advisors or whoever leave off? You can't assume that it's all going to be exactly where you were. I think you need to ask them, what are you thinking about this issue now? What do you want to do here? Is there any changes to what you're thinking or what the minister's thinking? I think it's really important to do that. And obviously be careful, as I said to you before, watching for shifts in priorities. I think is really important. Really study that is really important. So I think the takeout there is, don't assume everyone's sort of fully running on the road yet. I think there's a bit of organisation to go. So be tolerant, be patient. Patience will pay off. Don't sort of lob 10 emails into an advisor's email and expect them to be, sit straight up to attention. It's not quite that yet. I think there's quite a bit of organisation still happening right across the parliament. So, as I said before, you need to align with the government priorities. So framing your agenda in government terms. I'm not saying to say you're a sycophant to government. You can only do that. And if you don't do that, you're stupid. I'm not saying that. But I think in the first instance, you need to see where what you're trying to sell aligns to what they're trying to sell and see whether you can work together. It's pretty simple, right? It's not that illogical. That's not to say you don't disagree with them ever, or that you don't put forward other ideas that go beyond that. But that's a starting point to your discussions. I think it's really important to think about it in those terms. There may be some areas for some of the ministers, or certainly the backbenchers, there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of new ones, that are silent or have no knowledge on your ideas or your solutions. Use that as an opportunity to perhaps give them information, arm them with the data. What will happen if if this idea is not done? What's the impact? What's going to happen if it's not done or it's not acted on in real terms? Human cost, economic, budgets, social costs. I'm sure you probably got access to the data on that. Engaging strategically. I always say start with advisors. I am a former advisor of many years in different governments and oppositions, and also for the British Labor Party. And, I think that ministerial advisors are often more accessible and candid than the ministers themselves, certainly more honest. You can use these meetings to build momentum and get some sort of honest reading on what is happening and what you may need to do. Complement those discussions that you're having with political stakeholders with departmental engagement. So I'm sure particularly for those people who are in Canberra, you probably have a reasonable connection with the people in Parliament, or sorry, in the departments. If not, try and get across who it is that you should be talking to. Go in and have an exploratory conversation with them about what they're thinking. They'll all probably be breathing a bit of a sigh of relief, because they know that 75% of them won't be made redundant in the next little while. So that's probably, dare say, put them into a better mood. And as I said to you, backbench opportunities are so important. So, get across the people that are operating in your area. So you've got 3 Labor MPs in Canberra, House of Representative MPs in the seat of Bean. David Smith was challenged reasonably robustly by an independent. I dare say that everyone's going to be on their toes after this election. Everyone's going to be wanting to meet with people. And if you've even gone on to, I've noticed that, say, Andrew Lee, who I do follow on Instagram, meets with all sorts of people and puts pictures, local people who are not in his portfolio, puts pictures on his social media feeds. So I think it's about thinking how can you have those conversations? And yes, it's Canberra, but you may have other people, you may be an organisation that also operates outside of Canberra as well. Thinking about all of those possibilities, I think, is important. Building some internal advocacy and time and time engagement. I'm not saying that crossbench or the opposition have no role in Parliament. It's really important to have an active and robust opposition and crossbench in order to keep the government held to account. That's what's called a Westminster system. It's called a democracy, and it's important. It's vital. But strategically, tactically, right now, at the next couple of weeks of sittings, trying to get the coalition to ask a question or raise an issue in a committee or whatever else probably isn't the moment to do it in the next couple of months. I think what you need to do is you need to get a no, you need to get a talk to the hand before you do that. Before you go somewhere else, I think you need to get, sorry, I'm falling over because I'm moving some out of the sun. Sorry, didn't mean to fall over. Consider a rolling campaign across the caucus. Really targeted meetings. I would think that if you go and start engaging with people, you've got a lot of people that you can talk to. A lot of people. I mean, imagine if you've got 20 of the backbenchers thinking about what you're doing. And I'm not saying that people in Canberra can't do that. You can, particularly if it's an issue that is a service delivery issue that may have national importance. And I can see many of you on the line. The reason I'm moving is that I've got windows that shine a light on me and I don't look like I'm an angel. There is a couple of key dates that we all need to be aware of: MAEFO and the federal budget. There's also sitting and non-sitting weeks. Now, there's, I think, reasonably limited time available because there isn't a lot of sitting weeks. There's been talk that there's not a lot of sitting weeks this year, and I think that's probably a reasonably fair assumption. I suppose from the government's point of view, that's a political decision they've made. That's not for me to, there's nothing that we can do about it. Got to go with what we've got. But there's lots of time. It's June the 5th today. We've got a whole 6.5 months ahead of us, or nearly 7 months ahead of us between now and the end of the year. So there's lots of physical time. You don't have to go and see people in a sitting week. You can absolutely, particularly people in Canberra, really easy to go and see people in their offices. You can think about planning events either in Parliament or outside of Parliament. If it's a sitting week, it really needs to be in Parliament. If it's a non-sitting week, can easily be outside of Parliament. It's about whether you're going to get people to leave the building if it's a sitting week, and ultimately it's difficult to get people to come to an event outside of Parliament in a sitting week. But I'm sure people in Canberra already know that. So let's have a think about the ACT from the ACT perspective. So leveraging, I think, there's a couple of things to say. It's a long-term Labor government, which it also needs, needs the support of others in the Parliament as well. So it's a Labor minority government here in Canberra, and it does work well with the federal government. Make sure that you have a good rapport between the Chief Minister and there is a good rapport between the Chief Minister and the Prime Minister. Suffice to say, you need to take advantage of that and the fact that the Prime Minister lives in Canberra for most of the time. And what are some of the opportunities you might be able to look at for some joint ideas between the two jurisdictions. So find some ACT-based federal ministers. You've got Andrew Leigh, that's the only one. And, how can you perhaps engage with him? He is in the Treasury portfolio and very influential. He's also not aligned factionally, so that helps and possibly hinders him, but that's a decision he's taken. Obviously, tapping into local connections. If you operate exclusively in the ACT, focus on building relationships with the MPs in Canberra. But there may be reason, as I said, there's no reason why if your operations or your interests or whatever you do goes beyond Canberra, you've got a whole lot of people that you can engage with as well. So don't limit it to just the ACT. And lastly, before we finish up, this is the last slide. So if anyone has got a question, don't hesitate to pop it into the Q&A box. I think it's really important to engage with both of them. There is a lot of opportunity for joint funding and joint initiatives, particularly in areas where jurisdictions are shared. So education, health infrastructure. Think about what's possible there. And, I'm not sure who's on the line, but there's obviously options, and feel free to email me offline if you'd like, no problem at all. So, the current ACT Chief Minister's been in place for quite a while. We also have Katie Gallagher, who is a minister in the Senate, and she is also reasonably very influential, and also a friend of mine, but she tends to not take meetings that are outside her portfolio, whereas I find that Andrew Leigh will do. He's obviously a local member of Parliament. He's a member of the House, therefore it's a bit duty bound to be listening to local concerns, whereas Katie is a senator. She obviously needs to think about the ACT-wide issues. So thinking about how you can position that when you go and talk to her, I think is important. The other senator that is there and very influential is Senator Pocock. Now, he's probably got less power in this parliament than he did in the last, but he's very vocal, and in terms of Canberra-based media, very continues to say a lot and be very forthright in what his views are. So go and seek the counsel of his office and his staff. He's got a big team. They're all very competent, and I would urge you to go and talk to them as well. So that brings us to the end of today. I don't think we've got any questions, but thanks so much for being with us today. We will be putting this up on YouTube, so if you need it, or if there's anyone else that you know that you would like to refer it to, we'll also send you the slides and the recording in a message. It'll come through to you from Eventbrite, but feel free to share those with anyone you would like. And again, if you'd like to email me, don't hesitate, no problem at all. It's Jo, J-O, at 50acres, FIFTYACRES.com. There's no AU there. So thanks so much again for joining us today. Really grateful for your time. Thanks for being with me. We've got 4 more coming, not next week, but the week after. It'll be really interesting. We're going to Tasmania. They may be in an election by then, or who knows, a new government. They're voting on a no confidence motion on the Premier today. So it looks likely to pass. And if that happens, then there will be a need to go to an election or try to form a new government. So as is the way with Westminster systems. But these are things that are fascinating. Well, I at least found them interesting. But thank you so much for your time. Really grateful. And have a great day, and good to see you all.